When I woke from my coma, my family exclaimed, "You're awake!" I blinked against the hospital lights, confused. Yes, the doctor said I've been stable for weeks. My husband Jake stumbled backward. My mother grabbed the bed rail. My sister Wilhelmina's face went sheet white. I looked at each of them and saw it clearly. Disappointment. They'd always treated me like the family ATM, but I thought nearly dying would change things. "Sweetheart," Jake said slowly, "maybe you should rest more. The doctor said you might slip back." "Actually, I feel amazing. They said I'm making a miraculous recovery." That's when I saw Jake exchange a look with Wilhelmina, a look that said everything. "Well," Mom said, forcing a smile, "miracles don't last forever. The doctors mentioned possible complications, right?" "No, they said I'm perfectly healthy. Except," I paused, watching them lean in eagerly, "the brain damage. I only have 6 months before complete cognitive failure." The lie slipped out so easily, and their reactions told me everything. Jake's eyes lit up. Wilhelmina actually smiled before catching herself. Mom rubbed my hand, saying, "At least you woke up to say goodbye." That night, I pretended to sleep. Through my unconscious state, I heard them in the hallway. "Her life insurance is $2 million, Jake whispered. "If she's mentally incompetent, I get power of attorney. The house is worth another $800,000, Wilhelmina added, plus her investment accounts. "We need documentation of her decline," Mom said. "Video evidence." I smiled behind closed eyes. During my coma, I'd been somewhat conscious. I'd heard every conversation about pulling the plug, about the inheritance, about Jake's girlfriend Melissa, who was waiting patiently. Over the next week, I played my part perfectly. I'd forget names, mix up words, called Jake Brian, his brother's name, just to watch him document it eagerly on his phone. When Wilhelmina mentioned needing money for her boyfriend's startup, I slurred, "I wish I could help, but my brain." Jake's eyes gleamed. "Actually, honey, could you sign something?" "Just medical paperwork." I pretended I couldn't read properly, but it was power of attorney documents, and a will leaving everything to him. "Whatever you need, sweetheart." What they didn't know was that signing under false pretenses made the documents void. And fraud. The real game started when Jake quit his job. "Why work when we'll be millionaires in 4 months?" he told Melissa on the phone, not knowing I'd installed recording apps on all our devices during my confused state. Wilhelmina maxed out credit cards buying a Tesla and designer bags. "Payment in full when the inheritance comes," she told creditors. Mom broke her lease and moved into a luxury apartment she couldn't afford. "My daughter's dying. I'll have money soon." During dinner, I decided to escalate. "The doctor said something odd today. My brain scans are improving. He thinks I might fully recover." Jake's wine glass shattered on the floor. "That's impossible. I mean, doctors can be wrong. Don't get your hopes up." "Yeah," Wilhelmina added quickly. "False hope is cruel." What they didn't know, I'd already transferred our assets to a trust they couldn't touch. The house was being sold to my lawyer for $1. The life insurance beneficiary had been changed to a charity. Every day they thought I was at treatment. I was securing evidence with my attorney. Jake started bringing me special smoothies. "For your health," he'd say, watching me drink. They tasted wrong. Bitter. I'd pretend to drink, then pour them out. The residue tested positive for mercury. They were literally poisoning me. One night I heard Jake on the phone with someone. "We need another 50 grand. She'll be gone in 2 months maximum. You understand what happens if you don't pay?" The voice was clearly a loan shark. "The insurance pays out soon. Her brain is deteriorating rapidly. They'd borrowed from criminals against my life." Sunday morning, I called a family meeting. The doctors want to discuss hospice options. They practically celebrated. Jake was already texting Melissa about wedding venues. But when they arrived at the hospital conference room, it wasn't doctors waiting. It was FBI agents, my lawyer, and Jake's girlfriend Melissa, who'd been working with police after Jake tried to poison her too when she'd threatened to expose him. The conference room door swung open, and Jake's face shifted from eager anticipation to total confusion. He'd been checking his phone in the hallway, probably texting Melissa about which funeral home to use, and now he stood frozen in the doorway staring at a man in a dark suit who definitely wasn't a hospice doctor. Regina pushed past him into the room and stopped so fast her purse swung forward and hit the doorframe. Wilhelmina came in last, and her mouth actually fell open when she saw the 3 other people in suits standing near the window. I watched all 3 of them process what they were seeing, watched their faces cycle through confusion to concern to something that looked a lot like panic. The man in the dark suit stepped forward and 2 uniformed officers moved to block the exits. Jake's hand twitched toward his pocket where his phone was, and one of the agents smoothly intercepted him, taking the phone before Jake could even react. I saw the exact second Jake understood what was happening because all the color drained from his face and his eyes went wide. Every text message he'd sent about my declining health, every call he'd made to Melissa about wedding plans, every conversation with that loan shark about needing more money before I died, all of it was sitting in that phone, and now it was in an FBI agent's hand. The man in the suit pulled out a badge and held it up for everyone to see. He introduced himself as Special Agent Victor Kramer and gestured to the other agents in the room, rattling off their names and positions so fast I barely caught them. The uniformed officers positioned themselves at both exits, and I watched Wilhelmina's eyes dart between them like she was already planning an escape route. Victor's voice was calm and professional as he explained that this wasn't a medical consultation. It was a federal investigation, and all three of them needed to stay exactly where they were. Jake's hand kept moving toward his empty pocket, like he couldn't quite believe his phone was gone. His fingers twitched and curled, and I could see him trying to remember what messages he'd sent recently. What evidence was sitting in his text history just waiting to destroy him? Alice stood up from where she'd been sitting in the corner and walked forward carrying a thick manila folder. She'd been my lawyer for 6 months now, ever since I first woke up and heard my family plotting in the hallway, and she'd spent all that time building a case so complete that no defense attorney could find a crack in it. She set the folder on the table, and it made a heavy thud that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Melissa sat in the opposite corner looking terrified but determined, her hands clasped so tight in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. I made eye contact with her, and something passed between us, an understanding that we'd both trusted the same man, and he'd tried to kill us both when we became inconvenient. She'd loved him, and I'd married him, and neither of those things had stopped him from mixing mercury into smoothies and watching us drink them. Victor opened the folder and pulled out a stack of bank statements. He started reading Jake his rights in that same calm, professional voice while spreading the statements across the table. I could see the numbers from where I sat, could see the highlighted sections showing Jake's attempts to transfer money out of our joint accounts and into ones with only his name. My husband's face went through about 5 different expressions in 10 seconds. First came denial, his mouth opening like he was going to claim this was all a mistake. Then came anger, his jaw clenching and his hands balling into fists. Finally, his face settled into something calculating and cold, and I could practically see the wheels turning as he tried to figure out which lies might still work. He was still thinking he could talk his way out of this because that's what Jake did. He talked and charmed and convinced people to believe whatever story he was selling. Regina started crying before Victor even turned to her, big dramatic tears rolling down her cheeks as she clutched her purse and claimed she didn't know anything about any of this. She was just a worried mother concerned about her dying daughter. She'd never discussed money or insurance or inheritance. Victor let her finish her whole performance before he pulled out a recording device and pressed play. Regina's voice filled the room, crystal clear as she talked to an insurance adjuster about my life insurance policy. She was asking about payout timelines and whether mental incompetence would affect the claim and how quickly the money could be transferred once I died. Her fake tears dried up real fast when she heard her own voice confessing to conspiracy. She tried to grab for the recorder, but an agent stepped between her and Victor, and she stumbled backward into a chair. Wilhelmina bolted. She actually made it 3 steps toward the door before an officer caught her arm and pulled her back. She was crying too now. Ugly, desperate sobs as she begged them to let her go. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just supporting her sister during a difficult time. Victor pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of the Tesla she'd bought on credit 2 weeks ago. He explained that it was repossessed at this exact moment, along with all the designer bags and clothes she'd charged to credit cards she couldn't pay. She'd told the credit card companies that payment would come through when her sister's inheritance was settled, which was fraud on top of conspiracy. Wilhelmina collapsed into a chair and put her head in her hands, her whole body shaking. A woman in a lab coat stepped forward, and Victor introduced her as a forensic toxicologist. She opened her own folder and pulled out lab reports with official letterhead and colored graphs. She explained in careful detail that the smoothie residue I'd saved showed dangerous levels of mercury, the kind of levels that cause organ failure and neurological damage. Jake's face went pale as she talked about half-lives and accumulation rates, and how the dosage wasn't accidental contamination from food or environment. This was deliberate poisoning designed to cause symptoms that would look like my supposed brain condition was getting worse. The expert pointed to specific numbers on her charts showing that the mercury levels were high enough to kill me within months if I'd kept drinking those smoothies every day like Jake had encouraged. Melissa spoke up for the first time since we'd all entered the room. Her voice shook, but she pushed through it, describing how Jake had brought her smoothies too when she'd threatened to tell me about their affair. She'd thought he was being sweet, trying to apologize and make things right, but the smoothies made her violently sick. She'd ended up in the emergency room twice before she figured out that they only made her sick when Jake made them. The toxicologist nodded and pulled out more lab reports, these ones from samples taken from Melissa's apartment. Mercury was found in her blender and in residue from cups she'd saved, proving that Jake had a pattern of using poison to eliminate women who became problems for him. Melissa's hands were shaking as she talked, but she kept going, describing how Jake had told her I'd be gone soon, and they could be together, how he'd promised her my house and my money and a life she'd never have to work for. Victor took over again and explained that they'd been investigating for 3 weeks, ever since Melissa first contacted them, scared and sick and suspicious. Every conversation I'd had with my family had been monitored and recorded. Every financial transaction was tracked through multiple agencies. They'd watched Jake meet with a man named Solomon Pike twice at a diner downtown, watched money change hands, watched Jake borrow more and more against my life insurance policy that he thought would pay out any day. Agent teams had followed all 3 of them, documenting their spending and their plans, and their complete certainty that I'd be dead within weeks. The name Solomon Pike made Jake gasp out loud. His calculating expression finally cracked into something that looked like real fear, because loan sharks really don't appreciate FBI attention to their business operations. Victor explained that they'd arrested Pike 3 days ago on separate charges related to illegal lending and racketeering. Pike had been very cooperative about Jake's debt, about the threats he'd made when Jake couldn't pay, about Jake's promises that insurance money was coming soon. Pike had recordings too, conversations where Jake discussed my deteriorating health and his timeline for my death. The loan shark had wanted insurance that he'd get paid, so he'd documented everything, and now all those recordings were evidence in a federal case against everyone in this room. Alice stepped forward with a folder thick enough to be a phone book and dropped it on the table between us and my family. The sound made Regina jump. Alice opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a power of attorney form with my signature at the bottom, except the signature looked shaky and wrong because I'd signed it while pretending to be confused. She held it up so everyone could see it and explained that signing legal documents under false pretenses makes them completely void. She said the word fraud very clearly and slowly, like she wanted to make sure everyone understood what they'd done. Jake's face went even paler than before. Alice kept talking and said she'd been working with Victor and his team for 3 weeks now, ever since I first contacted her about what I'd overheard during my coma. She'd helped me transfer assets, change beneficiaries, and document every single conversation my family had about my money. She pulled out more papers showing bank transfers, insurance changes, and property transfers, all of them legal, and all of them done before Jake got me to sign anything. Regina's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Regina finally found her voice and stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. She pointed at me and said I manipulated them by lying about having brain damage. Her voice got louder as she talked, and she said I tricked them into thinking I was dying just so I could make them look bad. Victor didn't move from where he stood by the door, but his voice cut through Regina's yelling. He said my medical records showed I was never impaired at all, that every doctor who examined me confirmed I was cognitively normal. He pulled out a timeline showing that Jake, Regina, and Wilhelmina had discussed my life insurance and inheritance during my coma, weeks before I ever mentioned brain damage to anyone. The timeline had dates and times and quotes from their conversations that I'd heard while I was barely conscious. Regina sat back down hard. Victor explained that their conspiracy existed before my supposed cognitive decline, which meant they couldn't claim they were just responding to my condition. They'd wanted me dead or incompetent from the moment I woke up and disappointed them by being alive. A woman in a business suit stood up from the back of the room where I hadn't even noticed her sitting. Victor introduced her as an insurance investigator, who'd been tracking Jake's activities for the past month. She walked to the front and opened her own folder and started talking about fraud alerts. She explained that when Jake tried to take out $2 million in life insurance on me, it triggered automatic alerts across multiple insurance companies. A healthy woman in her 30s with a husband who suddenly quit his job and started asking about policy payouts raised red flags everywhere. The investigator pulled out forms Jake had filled out and pointed to the parts where he'd lied about my health, about his employment status, and about his financial situation. She said insurance companies share information about suspicious claims, and Jake's name was now flagged in every database in the country. Even if I had died, even if his plan had worked, he wouldn't have gotten a penny because the policies were void from the moment he lied on the applications. Jake's calculating expression finally cracked, and he looked genuinely scared for the first time since we walked into this room. Wilhelmina made a sound like a wounded animal, and her whole body started shaking. She put her hands over her face, and her words came out muffled and broken. She said Jake convinced her that I was dying anyway, so they might as well benefit from it. She said Regina told her it was practical planning, not murder, just making sure the money went to family instead of strangers. She kept saying she didn't know, she didn't understand. She thought they were just being realistic. Victor walked over to where she sat and pulled out his phone. He played a recording of Wilhelmina's voice, clear and excited, talking about buying a Tesla and a vacation home in Florida with her inheritance share. The recording was from 2 weeks into my fake decline, and Wilhelmina was laughing about how she'd always wanted a luxury car. Victor played another recording where Wilhelmina suggested they should document my confusion more carefully so the insurance company couldn't challenge the claims. Her voice on the recording sounded nothing like the sobbing woman in front of us. Victor said she was an enthusiastic participant from the start, not a victim of Jake's manipulation. Jake spoke for the first time since the toxicology report, and his voice came out rough. He said he wanted a lawyer. Victor actually smiled a little bit and nodded like Jake had finally done something smart. Victor said that was absolutely his right, and he should definitely get the best lawyer he could afford, which wouldn't be very good since Jake was broke and in debt to a loan shark. Victor started listing charges, and his voice stayed calm and professional while he destroyed my family's lives. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, forgery, filing false insurance claims. Each charge came with a potential sentence, and Victor added them up as he went. Jake was looking at decades in prison. Regina and Wilhelmina were looking at serious time too, even if they cooperated. Victor explained that all 3 of them were being arrested right now, and officers were already outside waiting to take them into custody. He said they'd each get separate lawyers and separate holding cells to prevent them from coordinating their stories. 2 uniformed officers came through the door, and Regina looked at me directly for the first time since we'd entered this room. Her eyes weren't sad or sorry or scared. They were furious. She stared at me with pure rage like I'd done something wrong by not dying on schedule. Her mouth twisted into something ugly, and I could see her thinking about all the ways she wanted to hurt me for outsmarting her. In that moment, I understood something I'd been trying not to see my whole life. My mother genuinely believed she deserved my money more than I deserved my life. She thought her wants were more important than my existence. She wasn't a desperate person who made one terrible choice. She was someone who'd looked at her daughter and calculated my worth in dollars and found me more valuable dead than alive. The officer touched her arm to guide her up, and she jerked away from him, but she stood. She kept staring at me, and I stared back and didn't look away until they turned her toward the door. They took them out one at a time so they couldn't talk to each other or plan their defense together. Jake went first, and he'd gone completely silent again, back to that calculating look like he was already working through legal strategies and plea deals. He didn't look at me or Melissa or anyone else. He just walked between the officers with his head up like he was going to a business meeting instead of jail. Regina went next, and she started talking the second they got her to the door. Her voice carried back into the room as she threatened to sue me for entrapment and false imprisonment and whatever other legal terms she'd picked up from TV shows. She said her lawyer would destroy me in court and prove I'd manipulated everyone. The officer guided her out, but her voice kept echoing down the hallway. Wilhelmina went last, and she was crying, so hard she could barely walk. She kept saying her life was ruined over and over between sobs. An officer had to practically hold her up as they moved toward the door. She looked back at me once, and her face was covered in tears and makeup, and she looked nothing like my sister anymore. The door closed behind them, and the room suddenly felt huge and empty. It was just me, Alice, Melissa, and Victor now. My hands started shaking, and I couldn't make them stop. The adrenaline that had kept me calm and focused during the confrontation drained out all at once, and my whole body felt weak. Alice noticed right away and put her hand on my arm and guided me into one of the chairs. My legs gave out as I sat, and I realized I'd been standing rigid for over an hour. Victor got bottles of water from somewhere and handed one to me and one to Melissa. The cold plastic felt real and solid in my shaking hands. I tried to open it, but my fingers wouldn't work right, and Alice took it from me and opened it and handed it back. I drank, and the water was cold going down, and it helped me remember how to breathe normally. Victor sat down across from me, and his voice was gentler now than when he'd been reading charges. He explained what would happen next in the investigation and prosecution. The district attorney was pursuing maximum charges because the premeditation was so clear, and the poisoning attempts made it especially serious. With Pike's cooperation, they could prove Jake's financial motive extended beyond just wanting my money to owing dangerous people money he'd borrowed against my life. Victor said the DA wanted this case to send a message that you can't plot to murder your spouse for insurance money and expect a light sentence. He talked about arraignments and bail hearings and grand juries, and it all started to blur together. Alice took notes on her phone and told me not to worry about remembering everything right now. Victor said they'd need me to testify eventually unless Jake and the others took plea deals, which he thought they probably would once they saw how much evidence existed. Melissa spoke up, and her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear her. She said she was sorry. I looked at her, and she was crying but trying not to, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. She said she genuinely didn't know about the murder plot until Jake tried to poison her too. She thought he was just cheating, which was bad enough, but she didn't know he was trying to kill me until she ended up in the emergency room and started putting pieces together. She said she knew I probably hated her and she understood why, but she wanted me to know she was sorry for being part of the affair, even if she hadn't known about the rest. I looked at this woman who'd slept with my husband, and who'd almost died the same way I almost died, and I realized we were both victims of the same man. We'd both trusted someone who saw us as problems to eliminate. I told her I believed her and I didn't hate her. We were both women who trusted the wrong man and nearly died for it. Alice pulled out a thick folder and spread documents across the table in front of me. She pointed to each paper as she explained what we'd done to protect everything. The house sale to her for $1 was completely legal and already recorded with the county. She showed me the deed transfer and the notary stamps and all the official signatures that made it real. The trust we'd set up was iron tight and nobody could touch it. Not creditors or court judgments or anything else. My investment accounts had been moved into protected instruments before any of the fraud happened, so there was no way Jake or Regina or Wilhelmina could claim they had rights to any of it. She walked me through each document and I realized how much work she'd done while I was pretending to be confused and dying. Every asset I owned was locked away where my family couldn't reach it no matter what happened in court. Victor leaned forward when I asked about Pike and the loan shark's claims on my insurance money. He said criminal debts aren't legally collectible in any court, and Pike was already facing charges for illegal lending and probably racketeering too. Any agreement Jake made with him was void because it was based on planned murder, which meant Pike couldn't enforce the debt even if he wanted to. The FBI had been watching Pike for months before my case came up, and Jake's borrowing actually gave them the evidence they needed to arrest him. Victor said Pike was cooperating now because he didn't want to face federal prison time, and his testimony would help prove Jake's financial motive for trying to kill me. I felt relief wash through me knowing that particular threat was gone. A detective from local police walked in about an hour later. He was older, with gray hair and tired eyes, and he sat down across from me with a recording device and a notepad. He said he needed my formal statement for the case file, starting from when I woke up from the coma all the way through to today. I started talking, and it took almost 2 hours to get through everything. I described waking up and seeing the disappointment on their faces, hearing them plot in the hallway, pretending to forget things and sign fake documents, listening to Jake on the phone with Pike, pouring out the poisoned smoothies. The detective asked questions and made me go back over certain parts multiple times, and I had to relive every moment of betrayal in official detail. My voice got hoarse and my throat hurt, and by the end I was exhausted from putting it all into words for the record. The detective thanked me and said my statement was clear and detailed and would be crucial for prosecution. Victor mentioned they'd need me to testify at trial unless Jake and the others took plea deals. Alice immediately jumped in and started talking about witness preparation. She said my testimony would be crucial because I was the victim, and I'd witnessed most of their planning firsthand. But it would also be hard emotionally. I'd have to sit in a courtroom and face Jake and Regina and Wilhelmina while I described how they tried to kill me. I'd have to answer questions from defense lawyers who would try to make me look like a liar or manipulator. Alice said we'd practice beforehand, and she'd be there with me the whole time, but I needed to understand it wouldn't be easy. The idea of seeing them again made my stomach turn, but I knew I had to do it if I wanted them to face real consequences. Melissa gave her statement next while I sat and listened. Her voice shook as she described the affair with Jake and how he'd told her I was dying and they'd be together soon. She talked about his comments that I'd be taken care of soon and how she thought he meant hospice care until she started getting suspicious. She described the smoothies he made her, the same kind he made for me, and how she got violently ill after drinking them for a week. She'd gone to the emergency room thinking she had food poisoning, and when the toxicology report came back showing mercury, she realized what Jake had done. She put together that if he was poisoning her, he was probably poisoning me too, and that's when she went to the police. Her testimony lined up perfectly with mine and proved Jake had a pattern of poisoning women who became problems for him. The detective nodded while she talked and made notes about consciousness of guilt and repeated criminal behavior. By evening, they said I could leave. Victor and the detective had everything they needed for now, and Alice had handled all the legal paperwork. But when I stood up to go, I realized I didn't have anywhere to go. The house was in legal limbo because of the sale to Alice, and even if I could go back there, I couldn't stand the thought of sleeping in the bed I'd shared with Jake. Every room would remind me of him watching me drink poisoned smoothies and documenting my fake mental decline on his phone. I stood there in the conference room feeling lost, and Alice must have seen it on my face because she immediately offered her guest room. She said I could stay as long as I needed while we figured out permanent housing. Melissa asked if we could stay in touch. Not as friends exactly, but as people who understood what we'd survived. I gave her my new phone number and she put it in her contacts, and there was something sad but also comforting about having this connection with someone who'd been through the same nightmare. Alice drove me to her house and showed me the guest room. It was small and plain with blue walls and a bed with white sheets, and nothing that reminded me of my old life. I sat on the edge of the bed after she left and just stared at the wall. The strategic mask I'd worn for weeks suddenly cracked and I started crying. Not quiet tears, but huge sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for the family I thought I had, the mother who was supposed to protect me, the sister who was supposed to love me, the husband I'd trusted with my life. I cried for the years I'd spent being their ATM and thinking that was normal. I cried for the woman I'd been before the coma, who was naive enough to think nearly dying would make them care about me. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen and I couldn't cry anymore. Alice knocked softly and came in without waiting for an answer. She sat on the bed next to me and didn't say anything for a while. Then she told me she'd seen enough cases to know that justice doesn't heal betrayal. It just stops the people who betrayed you from doing more damage. Sometimes that has to be enough because you can't undo what they did or make them into different people. You can only protect yourself and move forward and build something new. She said it wasn't fair and it wasn't what I deserved, but it was reality. I nodded because I knew she was right, even though it hurt to hear. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing constantly. Alice brought me coffee and told me the arrests had hit the news overnight. I looked at my phone and saw dozens of messages from people I hadn't talked to in years. Old coworkers and distant relatives and high school friends all suddenly concerned about my well-being and wanting to know if I was okay. The local news had picked up the story as a bizarre attempted murder case, and apparently it was getting shared all over social media. People were calling it the Coma conspiracy and the insurance murder plot and making it sound like a movie instead of my actual life. I scrolled through the messages and most of them felt fake, like people just wanted to be part of the drama. A few seemed genuine, but I didn't have the energy to respond to anyone yet. I turned my phone off and drank my coffee and tried to figure out what came next. I scrolled through the messages for another hour before I found one that made me stop. Sarah Kim had been my roommate in college and my closest friend before I met Jake. She wrote that she'd seen the news and wanted to know if I was okay, and if there was anything she could do to help. Her message felt different from all the others, because she didn't ask for details about the arrests, or try to insert herself into the drama. She just offered to listen if I needed someone to talk to. I typed back that I was staying with my lawyer temporarily, and gave her the address. She responded within minutes saying she was driving up from the city, and would be there by dinner. When she arrived 6 hours later carrying takeout containers and a duffel bag, I opened the door and started crying before she even said hello. She set everything down and hugged me while I sobbed into her shoulder. And for the first time since the arrests, I felt like I had someone in my corner who actually cared about me as a person, instead of as a victim or a news story. We stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about everything that happened, and Sarah told me she'd always thought Jake was controlling, but hadn't known how to say anything without me getting defensive. Having her there made Alice's guest room feel less like a temporary hiding place and more like a safe space where I could start figuring out my next steps. 3 days later, Alice called me into her home office because the prosecutor wanted to meet. We drove to the district attorney's office downtown and sat in a conference room with a woman named Angela Brooks, who handled major fraud and attempted murder cases. She spread out folders containing evidence against Jake, Regina, and Wilhelmina, while explaining that her office was considering plea deals for my mother and sister if they agreed to testify against Jake. The deals would require them to plead guilty to conspiracy charges and accept significant prison time, along with full restitution for the money they'd spent expecting my death. Angela said Regina would likely get 10 to 12 years, and Wilhelmina would get 6 to 8 years if they cooperated. But without their testimony, the trial against Jake became more complicated and expensive. She wanted to know how I felt about offering these deals before she made any formal proposals to their lawyers. I looked at the recordings transcripts showing my mother calculating insurance payouts and my sister buying luxury items on credit, and I told Angela I wanted them to face real consequences. These weren't desperate people who made one terrible choice in a moment of weakness. They spent weeks planning my death, celebrating my fake decline, and spending money they expected to inherit after I died. Regina had been my mother for 32 years, and she'd chosen $2 million over my life without a second thought. Wilhelmina had been my sister, and she'd bought a Tesla before I was even supposedly dead. That level of calculated greed deserved serious punishment, not a slap on the wrist in exchange for testimony against Jake. Angela nodded and made notes about my position, then said she'd keep me informed about any developments in the plea negotiations. The next morning, Alice got a call from Wilhelmina's lawyer trying to set up a negotiation meeting. Wilhelmina wanted to claim she'd been manipulated by Jake and Regina into believing I was actually dying, and that she'd only participated because she thought she was helping plan for my inevitable death, rather than causing it. Her lawyer apparently believed this narrative would get her a lighter sentence or possibly probation if she agreed to testify against the others. Alice pulled up the recordings on her laptop, and we listened to Wilhelmina discussing her inheritance calculations 3 days after I woke from the coma. She'd known I was healthy and recovering, but she'd still participated in documenting my fake mental decline and spending money based on my anticipated death. The recordings proved she was actively calculating what she'd inherit and how she'd spend it, not reluctantly going along with someone else's plan. Alice told Wilhelmina's lawyer that any deal would need to include significant prison time because the evidence showed enthusiastic participation, not manipulation. The lawyer said he'd talk to his client and get back to us, but Alice didn't think Wilhelmina would accept a deal that involved actual consequences. Regina's response to plea deal offers was even more frustrating. Angela called to say that Regina had refused any deal and insisted on going to trial because her lawyer believed they could paint me as a vindictive daughter who'd entrapped her poor family. Apparently, Regina's defense strategy was to claim she'd been a concerned mother worried about her daughter's health, and that I'd manipulated everyone by lying about brain damage to make them look bad. Her lawyer thought a jury would sympathize with a mother who was just trying to prepare for her daughter's death, and that the recordings could be explained as practical planning rather than murder conspiracy. Angela said this defense was ridiculous given the evidence, but it meant Regina's case would go to trial in about 4 months. I asked if this meant Jake and Wilhelmina would also go to trial, and Angela explained that Jake's lawyer was actually being smarter about the situation. Jake's attorney understood that the poisoning evidence was damning, and that a jury would likely convict on attempted murder charges that carried life in prison. He was pushing hard for a plea deal that would give Jake a definite sentence instead of risking life without parole. Angela said her office was willing to consider it because trials were expensive and uncertain, but they wouldn't go below 20 years given the mercury poisoning attempts and the loan shark involvement. Jake had tried to kill both me and Melissa using poison, and that level of premeditation deserved serious time even with a plea deal. 2 weeks after the arrests, Alice sat me down and said I needed to start therapy. She'd noticed I was having trouble sleeping and that I'd started checking all my food and drinks obsessively before consuming anything. I told her I was fine and just being careful, but she said she'd seen enough trauma cases to know I was showing signs of PTSD from the poisoning attempts. She gave me contact information for a therapist named Dr. Lisa Park, who specialized in trauma from intimate partner violence. I didn't want to go because talking about feelings seemed pointless when I had legal proceedings to deal with, but Alice insisted and even made the first appointment for me. Dr. Park's office was in a quiet building with comfortable furniture and plants everywhere, and when I sat down for our first session, she asked me to describe what happened in my own words. I started with waking from the coma and seeing my family's disappointment, then moved through the fake brain damage and the poisoning attempts. When I got to the part about pretending to drink the smoothies while Jake watched me, I started shaking and couldn't continue. Dr. Park handed me tissues and said it was normal to have physical reactions when recounting trauma, especially when the person who hurt you was someone you'd trusted completely. Over the next few sessions, she helped me understand that the betrayal was actually worse than the physical danger, because Jake had violated the fundamental trust that marriage is supposed to be built on. He'd slept next to me while planning my death, kissed me while poisoning me, and pretended to care while documenting my fake decline. That level of intimate betrayal created a specific kind of trauma that was different from being attacked by a stranger. The legal proceedings moved slowly over the next several weeks while lawyers negotiated and evidence was reviewed. Angela called in early November to say that Wilhelmina had finally accepted a plea deal after her lawyer explained that going to trial would likely result in a longer sentence. Wilhelmina agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted fraud in exchange for 8 years in prison and orders to repay all the money she'd spent based on my anticipated death. The plea hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later at the county courthouse. Alice and I attended along with Angela and several FBI agents who'd worked on the case. Wilhelmina stood in front of the judge wearing an orange jumpsuit and looking much smaller than I remembered. Her lawyer read the plea agreement while she nodded along, and then the judge asked her to explain in her own words what she'd done. Wilhelmina's allocution was painful to watch because she admitted her actions, but framed everything as being caught up in Jake's manipulation. She talked about how Jake had convinced her that I was dying anyway, and that planning for the inheritance was just being practical. She never acknowledged that she'd actively hoped for my death so she could buy a Tesla and designer clothes. She never mentioned the recordings where she calculated her share of my assets, or the credit card bills she'd run up expecting to pay them off with inheritance money. She presented herself as a naive younger sister who'd been led astray by her evil brother-in-law, and it made me want to stand up and play the recordings right there in court. The judge clearly wasn't buying Wilhelmina's victim narrative because her response was sharp and direct. She said that Wilhelmina was an educated adult with a college degree and a professional career who'd made calculated choices to participate in a conspiracy to defraud her sister. The recordings proved she'd known I was healthy and recovering, but had chosen to participate anyway because she wanted money for luxury purchases. The judge emphasized that being influenced by someone else didn't excuse her actions, especially when she'd participated enthusiastically, and spent money before I was even supposedly dead. The 8-year sentence reflected that she was a willing participant who'd made deliberate choices, not an innocent victim of manipulation. Wilhelmina started crying when the judge pronounced the sentence, but I felt nothing except relief that she'd face real consequences for what she'd done. Regina's lawyer filed the subpoena for my medical records 2 weeks after Wilhelmina's sentencing. Alice called to tell me about it and explained that the defense was trying to build a narrative where my family had legitimate concerns about my health. The strategy made sense from a legal standpoint because if they could prove I actually had cognitive issues, then the conspiracy charges might not stick as firmly. But every neurologist who treated me during my recovery had documented that I showed no signs of brain damage or cognitive decline. The hospital records were clear and detailed. My brain scans showed normal function. The cognitive tests I took weekly during my supposed deterioration all came back perfect. The defense would find nothing in those files except proof that I was completely healthy while my family plotted my death. Alice explained that the trial date was set for 4 months out, which felt like forever when I just wanted this whole nightmare finished. But she reminded me that Regina's lawyer needed time to prepare a defense, and the prosecution needed time to organize all their evidence. 4 months meant sitting with the knowledge that my mother would eventually stand trial for trying to kill me. 4 months of knowing she'd fight back instead of accepting responsibility like Wilhelmina had done. Jake's plea negotiations were dragging on longer than anyone expected. Alice heard from the prosecutor's office that Jake wanted 15 years while they were pushing for 25. The gap seemed huge, and the sticking point was always the poisoning attempts. Jake's lawyer kept arguing that he never intended to kill anyone, just make me sick enough to sign documents while I was vulnerable. The claim was absurd because mercury poisoning doesn't just make someone temporarily ill. The prosecutor brought in medical experts who explained that the dosages Jake used could have caused permanent organ damage, kidney failure, neurological problems that would last the rest of my life. Jake's defense that he was only trying to make me compliant fell apart when doctors testified about what mercury actually does to the human body. Angela called in late January to tell me that Melissa would be testifying at a preliminary hearing about her own poisoning. The hearing was scheduled for the following week at the county courthouse. I asked if I should attend, and Angela said it wasn't necessary, but I was welcome to come if I wanted to support Melissa. I decided to go because Melissa had helped save my life by cooperating with the FBI, and watching her testify felt like the least I could do. The preliminary hearing took place in a smaller courtroom than I expected. Melissa sat in the witness box wearing a navy dress, and looking much healthier than the last time I'd seen her. The prosecutor asked her to describe her relationship with Jake, and she explained that they'd been dating for 8 months before my supposed brain damage diagnosis. She talked about how Jake told her I was dying and they'd be together soon, how he made plans for their future using money that would come from my death. Then the prosecutor asked about the smoothies. Melissa's voice shook when she described trusting Jake completely. He'd made her special protein smoothies for weeks, telling her they'd help her stay healthy and energetic. She drank them every morning because she believed he cared about her well-being. Then one day she started feeling sick at work. Her hands trembled. Her vision got blurry. She felt dizzy and confused. Her coworkers called an ambulance when she collapsed in the office bathroom. The emergency room doctors ran tests but couldn't figure out what was wrong at first. Her symptoms didn't match any common illness or condition. It wasn't until they ran a full toxicology panel that mercury showed up in her blood work at dangerous levels. The defense attorney tried to suggest that Melissa could have been exposed to mercury from other sources: environmental contamination, old thermometers, fish consumption. But Melissa calmly explained that the doctors asked about all those possibilities and ruled them out. The levels in her system were too high and too concentrated to come from normal environmental exposure. And when the FBI tested the blender Jake used to make smoothies, they found mercury residue in the container. The same container he used to make my smoothies. The same pattern of poisoning 2 different women who threatened his plans for easy money. Judge Hartwell presided over Jake's plea negotiations, and I could tell from her questions that the poisoning evidence disturbed her deeply. She asked the medical experts to explain mercury poisoning in detail. They described how mercury attacks the nervous system, damages kidneys, causes tremors, and cognitive problems that can become permanent. Judge Hartwell looked at Jake sitting at the defense table and asked his lawyer directly how anyone could claim these weren't murder attempts when the substance used causes such severe harm. Jake's lawyer stammered something about his client's ignorance of the medical effects, but the judge cut him off. She pointed out that Jake researched mercury poisoning extensively based on his internet search history. He knew exactly what he was doing. The plea negotiations finally concluded in early February, 3 months after the initial arrests. Jake accepted a deal for 22 years. He agreed to plead guilty to attempted murder for both Melissa and me, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of forgery and identity theft related to the power of attorney documents he'd forged. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Alice asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement at the sentencing. I said yes immediately because Jake needed to hear directly from me what he'd done. I spent a week writing and rewriting my statement, trying to find words that captured the specific horror of waking from a coma to discover your husband wished you'd died. Angela helped me practice reading it out loud without breaking down. The sentencing hearing filled a larger courtroom. Jake sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I remembered. His lawyer sat beside him shuffling papers. The prosecutor sat across the aisle with files stacked in front of her. I sat in the front row with Alice on one side and Angela on the other. Judge Hartwell entered and everyone stood. The prosecutor presented the case summary first, walking through the timeline of events from my coma through the arrests. She emphasized the planning and premeditation, the multiple victims, the use of poison as a weapon. Then she called me to give my victim impact statement. I walked to the podium on shaking legs and looked at the judge instead of at Jake. I described waking from my coma and seeing disappointment on my family's faces. I talked about pretending to have brain damage and watching my husband document my fake decline with eager excitement. I explained how he brought me smoothies every day, watched me drink them, kissed me goodnight while the mercury in my system built up to dangerous levels. I described the specific betrayal of being poisoned by someone who promised to love and protect me. Someone who slept beside me and planned my funeral and texted his girlfriend about wedding venues while I was supposedly dying. My voice broke when I talked about the fear that came after the FBI arrests. The knowledge that Jake had been actively trying to kill me created a different kind of trauma than discovering he wanted me dead. He'd taken action. He'd put poison in my food. He'd watched me drink it. The man I trusted most in the world had tried to murder me slowly while pretending to care for me. When I finished, Judge Hartwell thanked me and asked if Jake wanted to make a statement. His lawyer nodded, and Jake stood up. What came out of his mouth was the most infuriating non-apology I'd ever heard. Jake talked about making mistakes under financial pressure. He said he never intended to hurt anyone, and that things just spiraled out of control. He claimed he loved me and never wanted me to suffer. He said the poisoning was just meant to make me sick enough to sign documents, not to kill me. He talked about being sorry for the pain he caused, but never actually said he was sorry for trying to murder me. Every word was carefully crafted to minimize what he'd done while technically admitting guilt. His lawyer had clearly coached him on what to say to appear remorseful, without actually taking responsibility. Judge Hartwell's face hardened as Jake spoke. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment before responding. She said Jake's statement proved he still didn't understand the gravity of his crimes. She emphasized that he hadn't just stolen money or committed fraud. He'd tried to murder his wife and his girlfriend when they became inconvenient to his plans for easy wealth. She noted that he showed no genuine remorse, only regret at being caught. She pointed out that his claim about not intending to kill anyone was contradicted by every piece of evidence in the case. Judge Hartwell sentenced him to the full 22 years. She recommended he serve the time at a maximum security facility, given the calculated nature of his crimes. She ordered him to pay restitution for medical expenses and legal costs, though we all knew he had no money to pay anything. As officers led Jake out of the courtroom, he looked at me once. There was no apology in his eyes, just anger that I'd outsmarted him. 4 months after the initial arrests, Regina's trial began. Her defense strategy became clear during opening statements. Her lawyer painted her as a concerned mother worried about her daughter's declining health. He claimed that any discussions about inheritance were just practical planning for my care after I became incompetent. He suggested that Regina's spending was unrelated to my situation, and that she'd always lived beyond her means. The narrative tried to separate her financial decisions from the conspiracy charges. The prosecution destroyed this strategy within the first hour of testimony. They played recordings of Regina discussing my life insurance payouts with Wilhelmina before I ever mentioned brain damage. The audio was crystal clear. Regina's voice calculating how much money she'd inherit, her excitement about the house being worth $800,000, her plans to buy a luxury condo and a new car. The recordings proved she'd been planning to benefit from my death before I gave her any reason to think I was actually dying. The prosecutor played more recordings showing Regina calculating inheritance amounts weeks before I mentioned any brain damage. Her voice came through the courtroom speakers discussing how she'd spend the insurance money, what kind of condo she'd buy, whether she should get a new car or save that money for travel. The timestamps proved everything. She'd been planning her financial future based on my death before I ever gave her a reason to think I was dying. Her lawyer tried to argue that mothers naturally worry about their children's futures and make practical plans. The prosecutor shot that down fast. He pointed out that normal mothers don't calculate inheritance payouts while their daughters are in comas. Normal mothers don't discuss pulling the plug to speed up insurance claims. Normal mothers don't spend money they don't have based on their children dying soon. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand knowing Regina would stare at me the whole time. The prosecutor asked me to describe our relationship history. I started with my earliest memories of being the family bank account. Regina would call asking for money to cover her rent, her car payment, her credit card bills. She always had some crisis that only I could solve with my checkbook. When I got my first real job after college, she told me I owed her for raising me. When I got married, she expected me to pay for the entire wedding because I could afford it. When I bought my house, she moved into a more expensive apartment and told me I should cover the difference since I was doing so well. Every birthday, every holiday, every random Tuesday, she needed money for something. And I gave it to her because she was my mother, and I thought that's what family did. The prosecutor asked about emotional support. I explained that Regina never asked how I was doing unless she needed something first. When I got promoted at work, she wanted to know how much my raise was, so she could calculate what I could afford to give her. When I had a health scare before the coma, she spent the hospital visit talking about her own problems. When I tried to set boundaries about money, she'd cry about being abandoned by her ungrateful daughter. The pattern was clear and it had been going on for years. I was the ATM, not the daughter. Then the prosecutor asked about waking from the coma. I described opening my eyes and seeing disappointment on Regina's face. Not relief that I survived. Not joy that I was awake. Just this flash of disappointment before she caught herself and forced a smile. I told the jury about hearing her in the hallway that first night, discussing my life insurance with Wilhelmina like they were planning a shopping trip. I explained how Regina immediately started talking about my supposed cognitive decline, encouraging doctors to document problems that didn't exist, pushing for declarations of incompetence that would give Jake power of attorney. The prosecutor showed the jury Regina's spending records. She'd broken her lease and moved into a luxury apartment she couldn't afford 2 weeks after I mentioned brain damage. She told her landlord that her daughter was dying and she'd have money soon. She bought expensive furniture on credit with delivery scheduled for 6 months out, right around when she expected me to be dead or completely incompetent. She made deposits on a new car and a cruise, both scheduled for after my supposed cognitive failure. Every purchase was timed to my expected death. Regina's lawyer stood up for cross-examination. He tried to make me look vindictive and manipulative. He asked why I lied about brain damage if I wasn't trying to trap my family. He suggested I was a cruel daughter who enjoyed watching my mother suffer. He implied I fabricated evidence and manipulated recordings to frame innocent people who were just worried about my health. His strategy was obvious. Make the jury think I was the villain, not Regina. I stayed calm and explained exactly why I started recording. I told the jury that I'd been somewhat conscious during my coma. I heard Regina, Wilhelmina, and Jake discussing whether to pull my plug. I heard them calculating insurance payouts and inheritance amounts. I heard them talking about how long they should wait before ending my life support so it wouldn't look suspicious. When I woke up and saw their disappointment, I knew I needed proof of what they were planning. I only started recording after I heard them actively discussing my murder for money. That wasn't entrapment. That was self-defense. The lawyer tried another angle. He asked why I didn't just confront them or cut them off. Why did I pretend to have brain damage instead of being honest? I explained that I needed evidence that would hold up in court. If I'd just accused them, they would have denied everything. But by giving them what they wanted, by pretending to decline mentally, I got them to document their own crimes. They recorded videos of my supposed confusion. They discussed their plans on phone calls. They spent money they didn't have based on my anticipated death. Every action they took proved their intent to defraud insurance companies and steal my assets. The lawyer's last attempt was asking if I felt any guilt about destroying my family. I looked at Regina while I answered. I said I didn't destroy my family. They destroyed themselves when they chose money over my life. I didn't make Regina discuss pulling my plug. I didn't make her break her lease for an apartment she couldn't afford. I didn't make her calculate insurance payouts while I was in a coma. She made those choices. She committed those crimes. All I did was survive and collect evidence of what she was planning to do to me. The jury went out to deliberate after closing arguments. 6 hours passed while I sat in the hallway with Alice. My hands shook the entire time. I kept thinking about what would happen if they didn't believe me. What if they thought I really was vindictive? What if Regina walked free? Alice kept reminding me that the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the financial records, the toxicology reports, all of it pointed to conspiracy and attempted fraud. But I couldn't relax until I heard the verdict. When the jury came back, I watched each face trying to read their decision. The forewoman stood and announced guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted fraud. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Regina's face went white and then red. She started shaking her head like she could refuse the verdict. Her lawyer put his hand on her arm, but she shook him off. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. Regina's sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I arrived early and sat in the front row with Alice. Regina was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hair flat and her face pale. She looked smaller somehow, like being in jail had shrunk her. The judge entered and everyone stood. When we sat back down, Regina stared straight ahead, not looking at me at all. The prosecutor presented his sentencing recommendation first. He asked for the maximum of 15 years based on Regina's complete lack of remorse and the severity of her crimes. He pointed out that she'd shown no guilt during the trial, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology to her daughter. He emphasized that as my mother, Regina had a special duty of care that she violated in the most fundamental way possible. She'd actively planned my death for financial gain. That deserved serious punishment. Regina's lawyer argued for leniency. He claimed Regina was a woman who made poor choices under financial stress. He said she never actually tried to kill me, just planned to benefit if I died naturally from my supposed condition. He suggested a shorter sentence of 5 to 7 years would be appropriate given her age and lack of prior criminal record. No, he painted her as a desperate woman who got caught up in circumstances beyond her control. The judge asked if Regina wanted to make a statement. Regina stood up slowly. She looked at the judge and said she was sorry for any pain she caused. But then she turned to me and her face changed. She said I'd destroyed the family by refusing to help when they needed money. She claimed I'd always been selfish and cold. She said I trapped them by pretending to be sick, and then punished them for caring about my future. Her voice got louder as she talked. She said I'd ruined her life, and Wilhelmina's life, and Jake's life over money that I didn't even need. She said I should be ashamed of myself for putting my own mother in prison. The judge's face hardened as Regina spoke. When Regina finally sat down, the judge looked at her for a long moment. Then she said Regina's statement proved she still didn't understand the gravity of her crimes, or accept responsibility for her actions. The judge noted that Regina showed no genuine remorse, only anger at being caught and punished. She emphasized that Regina hadn't just made poor financial choices. She'd conspired to murder her daughter and defraud insurance companies. She'd celebrated her daughter's supposed decline and spent money she didn't have based on her daughter's anticipated death. The judge sentenced Regina to 12 years in prison. She recommended Regina serve the time at a medium security facility and ordered her to pay restitution for legal costs and the money she'd fraudulently spent. As the judge finished speaking, Regina screamed at me across the courtroom. She yelled that I'd destroyed the family and I'd regret this. She said I was an ungrateful daughter who deserved to die alone. Security officers moved toward her, but she kept screaming about how I'd ruined everything. They had to physically remove her from the courtroom while she was still yelling about what a terrible person I was. I sat there watching security drag my mother out and felt nothing but relief. Not satisfaction exactly. Not happiness. Just this deep relief that she couldn't hurt me anymore. She couldn't call asking for money. She couldn't guilt me into funding her lifestyle. She couldn't plot my death for insurance payouts. For the first time in my life, I was free from her manipulation and control. Alice squeezed my hand, and we walked out of the courthouse together into the afternoon sun. With all 3 family members convicted and sentenced, I started rebuilding my actual life. Alice helped me find a small condo in a different neighborhood across town. 2 bedrooms, updated kitchen, small balcony with a view of the park. No memories of Jake or Regina or Wilhelmina. No ghosts in the corners. Just clean space that was entirely mine. We spent a weekend furniture shopping and I bought everything new. New couch, new bed, new dishes, new everything. I wanted nothing from my old life in this new space. The insurance companies finished their investigations about a month after Regina's sentencing. They confirmed no payouts to anyone involved in the conspiracy. Jake wouldn't get life insurance money. Regina wouldn't get inheritance. Wilhelmina wouldn't get her share of assets. Everything stayed with me or went to the charity I designated as beneficiary during my fake decline. The insurance investigators also flagged all three of them in industry databases. They'd never be able to take out policies on anyone else or be named as beneficiaries without triggering fraud alerts. Their names were permanently marked in the system. My phone rang one evening while I was unpacking boxes in the new condo. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. A woman's voice asked if I was Regina's daughter. I said yes, carefully. She introduced herself as my father's sister, my aunt. She said she'd seen news coverage of the trial and wanted to reach out. I almost hung up because I didn't know I had an aunt. But she kept talking. She explained that Regina had cut off my father's entire family after he died. She'd refused to let them see me, returned their letters, blocked their calls. She'd isolated me completely from his side of the family. We talked for 2 hours that first call. My aunt told me stories about my father that I'd never heard. How he worried about Regina's materialism and her focus on money over everything else. How he'd insisted on setting up my inheritance in a trust that Regina couldn't touch, which she'd always resented. How he'd wanted me to know his family, but Regina made that impossible after his death. My aunt said she'd tried for years to contact me, but Regina blocked every attempt. She'd almost given up until she saw the trial coverage and realized I might finally be free from Regina's control. My aunt invited me to dinner at her house the following weekend. I drove to her neighborhood feeling nervous about meeting family I'd never known existed. But when she opened the door, I saw my father's eyes looking back at me. Same green color, same crinkles at the corners. She hugged me and I started crying right there on her porch. She led me inside where her husband and 2 kids were waiting. My cousins. I had cousins I'd never met. Over dinner, my aunt shared more stories about my father. She said he would be proud of how I protected myself. He'd always worried that Regina would try to control me through money and guilt. That's why he set up the trust the way he did, with provisions that kept Regina from accessing anything. He'd seen her manipulation tactics and wanted to make sure I had independence. My aunt said he used to tell her that I was strong and smart and would figure things out eventually. He'd believed in me even when Regina was trying to make me doubt myself. 6 months after the confrontation in the hospital conference room, I started a new job in the hospital administration. The position focused on patient advocacy and family communication protocols. After everything I'd been through, working in healthcare felt meaningful. I wanted to help improve systems that protected vulnerable patients from family members who might not have their best interests at heart. I wanted to make sure other people in comas had advocates watching out for them. My experience gave me perspective that most administrators didn't have. I met Melissa for coffee about 3 weeks after the sentencing hearings wrapped up. She texted asking if I wanted to talk, and I figured we might as well since we'd both survived the same person trying to kill us. The coffee shop she picked was neutral territory, not anywhere Jake would have taken either of us. She looked different without the stress of testifying hanging over her, younger somehow, and she ordered a regular coffee instead of anything fancy. We sat outside because neither of us wanted to feel trapped in a small space. She thanked me for not hating her, which felt strange because I didn't have energy left for hating anyone except the people who actually tried to murder me. She explained that she genuinely believed Jake when he said his marriage was over, that I was sick, and he was just waiting for the right time to leave. I told her I understood because predators are good at making you believe their lies. We talked about the smoothies, how similar his approach had been with both of us, and there was something almost clinical about comparing notes on our own attempted murders. She said her therapist told her she had a pattern of trusting the wrong men, and I said my therapist told me I had a pattern of ignoring red flags when people showed me who they really were. We didn't become friends exactly, but we exchanged numbers and agreed to check in occasionally. There's value in knowing someone who understands the specific betrayal of trusting someone who is actively planning your death while pretending to love you. She paid for both coffees even though I offered, and when we hugged goodbye, it felt like closing a chapter neither of us wanted to be part of, but couldn't pretend hadn't happened. My college best friend called me about 2 months after the trials ended. She'd gotten a job offer in my city and wanted to know if I thought she should take it. I told her yes before she even finished explaining the position, because I needed someone in my life who knew me before Jake, before the coma, before everything turned into a crime drama. She moved 3 weeks later and I helped her unpack boxes in her new apartment. Having her nearby felt like finding solid ground after months of feeling like I was floating through my own life. We started having dinner every Thursday. Nothing fancy. Just cooking at her place or mine and talking about normal things like work stress and bad dates, and whether we were too old to still watch reality TV. She never treated me like I was fragile or broken. Never asked careful questions about the trial or my family. She just showed up and made me laugh about stupid things, and reminded me that I used to be funny too, before everything happened. One night she made pasta and we drank too much wine and I cried about missing my dad, not Regina or Jake or Wilhelmina, but my actual dad who died when I was 12 and never got to see me become someone who could protect herself. She held my hand and said he'd be proud of me for surviving people who were supposed to love me but didn't. She helped me learn to trust people again without assuming everyone wanted something from me. When I got paranoid about her motives for moving here, she showed me her job offer and apartment lease and bank statements without me even asking, and then she told me gently that not everyone was keeping score of what I was worth. She introduced me to her work friends and included me in group dinners, and slowly I started feeling like a person who had a social life instead of someone whose entire family tried to murder her. She never made me feel like a charity case or a trauma victim, just like her friend who she'd missed and was glad to have nearby again. Therapy became part of my weekly routine like grocery shopping or doing laundry. My therapist specialized in trauma from family betrayal, which I didn't even know was a specialty until Alice recommended her. The first few sessions I just cried and couldn't form complete sentences about what happened. She didn't rush me or try to make me process faster than I could handle. She helped me understand that I was grieving multiple losses at once, not just the family I had, but the family I'd always hoped they might become. I'd spent years thinking maybe Regina would eventually see me as more than an ATM. Maybe Wilhelmina would stop treating our relationship like a transaction. Maybe Jake actually loved me under all the financial manipulation. My therapist said it was normal to mourn the fantasy family I'd wanted while accepting the reality of who they actually were. She explained that grief doesn't follow a neat timeline, that some days I'd be angry and some days I'd just feel empty, and some days I'd wonder if I'd done something to make them hate me enough to want me dead. She helped me work through the guilt I felt about setting them up, even though they'd set themselves up by actually trying to kill me. I kept thinking maybe I should have just divorced Jake quietly and walked away from Regina and Wilhelmina without exposing everything. My therapist asked if I thought they would have stopped trying to get my money if I'd just disappeared, and I realized they would have found another way to bleed me dry or worse. She taught me that protecting myself wasn't the same as hurting them, that they'd hurt themselves by choosing greed over basic human decency. We talked about my father a lot, about how he'd set up financial protections because he knew Regina couldn't be trusted. My therapist helped me see that he'd given me tools to survive even after he was gone, that using those tools didn't make me manipulative or cruel. She said the difference between me and my family was that I'd only acted to protect my life while they'd acted to end it. Some sessions were harder than others, especially when we discussed trust and relationships, and whether I'd ever be able to let someone close again without waiting for them to show their true motives. I met someone at work about 4 months after everything settled. He worked in the hospital finance, and we kept running into each other in the cafeteria during lunch breaks. He started sitting at my table, and we'd talk about normal things like weekend plans and whether the hospital coffee was getting worse, or if we were just getting more tired. I didn't tell him about my history at first, because I wanted to see if he'd like me without knowing I was the woman from the news whose family tried to murder her. We went to coffee a few times, then dinner, and I kept waiting for him to ask me for money, or start calculating my worth. He never did. He paid for his own meals and never asked about my salary or my assets or whether I owned property. When I finally told him about Jake and the trial and everything that happened, he listened without interrupting, and then asked if I was okay, not what happened to the money, or whether I was rich now. He said he understood if I needed to take things slowly, because that kind of betrayal doesn't heal fast. His patience felt like proof that not everyone was secretly calculating my worth in dollars. We went on actual dates where he planned activities based on things I mentioned liking, not expensive restaurants to impress me, but hiking trails I'd said looked interesting, or art exhibits I'd wanted to see. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give, never got frustrated when I needed space or time to process my feelings. He introduced me to his friends and family without making a big deal about my past, just presented me as someone he was dating and liked spending time with. His mom hugged me the first time we met, and didn't ask a single question about the trial or my family. I kept testing him in small ways, mentioning expensive things I couldn't afford to see if he'd offer to pay, talking about financial stress to see if he'd ask about my accounts. He never took the bait. He just treated me like a person he cared about, not a resource to exploit or a problem to solve. 6 months in, I finally started believing he might actually just like me for me, that not everyone was keeping a running tally of what they could get from me. The financial aftermath took about 6 months to fully settle into something stable. Alice had set up the trust perfectly, protecting everything from creditors and legal judgments, and my family's attempts to claim they deserved compensation. The house sold to her for $1 as planned. Then she sold it at market value and put the proceeds into the trust where nobody could touch it. My investment account stayed protected. My retirement funds remained intact, and the life insurance money went to the charity I'd designated as beneficiary. I wasn't wealthy by any means, but I was secure and independent. I had a good job in the hospital administration that paid enough to cover my bills and save a little. The condo was modest but mine, 1 bedroom in a safe neighborhood with parking and a small balcony. I bought furniture slowly, picking pieces I actually liked instead of whatever Regina had decided was appropriate for someone in my position. My car was practical and paid off. My credit cards had low balances I could manage, and I had an emergency fund that made me feel safe. Alice reviewed my finances quarterly to make sure everything stayed protected and properly managed. She'd become more than just my attorney, more like a financial advisor who actually cared whether I was okay. The trust was structured, so I could access income from the investments without touching the principal, giving me security without making me feel trapped by money I couldn't use. I donated to the charity that received Jake's intended life insurance payout, supporting their work with domestic violence survivors. Every month I transferred a small amount to savings, building something for myself that nobody else had claimed to. I wasn't rich and didn't want to be. Not after seeing what money had done to my family. Being secure and independent felt more valuable than any inheritance, more meaningful than the millions Jake and Regina had tried to steal. I could pay my bills, buy groceries, go out with friends occasionally, and sleep at night knowing nobody was plotting to take it all from me. A year after everything ended, I got a letter from Wilhelmina requesting a prison visit. I almost threw it away without reading it, but something made me open it. She said she'd been working with a therapist inside and wanted a chance to talk to me face to face. She wasn't asking for forgiveness exactly, just an opportunity to explain and apologize. I thought about it for 2 weeks before deciding to go. The prison was 2 hours away, and I drove there on a Saturday morning feeling sick the entire time. The visiting room was exactly like you see in movies. Small tables bolted to the floor and guards watching everything. Wilhelmina looked smaller somehow, older, wearing a prison uniform that hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight and her hair was shorter and she didn't have any makeup on. She cried when she saw me, which I hadn't expected. She thanked me for coming and said she understood if I hated her. I told her honestly that I didn't forgive her, and we wouldn't have a relationship when she got released, but I didn't wish her harm. She nodded like she'd expected that answer and said it was fair. She explained that she'd been working with her therapist on understanding how she justified hoping her sister would die for money, how she'd convinced herself it was okay because I had more than I needed anyway. She said the therapist was helping her see that she'd always been jealous of me, that Regina had pitted us against each other since we were kids. I listened but didn't offer comfort or absolution. She asked about my life and I kept my answers vague, not wanting to give her details she could use or obsess over. She said she was genuinely glad I survived and built a new life, that she hoped someday I might be able to think of her without just remembering the worst thing she'd ever done. I told her that might take a very long time or might never happen, and she said she understood. The visit lasted 30 minutes and felt like hours. When I left, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd closed a door I hadn't realized was still open. I never visited Regina or Jake and had no plans to change that. Regina sent letters that I returned unopened every time, not even bothering to read her excuses or justifications. Her handwriting on the envelopes was the same as always, careful and precise, and seeing it made my stomach hurt. I threw them in a box in my closet without opening them because I didn't need her version of events or her attempts to rewrite history. Jake's lawyer contacted me once asking if I'd be willing to meet with Jake so he could apologize. I told the lawyer no and asked him not to contact me again about Jake for any reason. Alice sent a formal letter making it clear that any further attempts at contact would be considered harassment. I blocked Regina's prison phone number after she tried calling twice. I blocked email addresses I suspected were hers when messages started coming through with subject lines about family and forgiveness. My therapist said it was healthy to maintain boundaries with people who'd tried to kill me, that I didn't owe them forgiveness or closure or anything else. Some relationships can't be repaired, and that's okay. I didn't feel guilty about cutting them off completely because they'd already cut me off in the most final way possible, when they decided I was worth more dead than alive. My aunt from my father's side asked once if I wanted to write to Regina since she was still my mother, and I explained that Regina stopped being my mother the moment she discussed pulling my plug to speed up inheritance payments. My aunt understood and never brought it up again. I focused on building relationships with people who actually cared about me, instead of wasting energy on people who'd proven they didn't. Jake and Regina could spend their prison time however they wanted, but they'd spend it without me participating in their rehabilitation, or their guilt, or their need for my forgiveness to feel better about themselves. My relationship with the guy from work developed slowly into something genuine and healthy. We dated for a year, taking our time, building trust through consistency and honesty. He never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with, never got frustrated when I needed reassurance or space. He met my aunt and my college best friend and they both approved, which mattered to me more than I'd expected. He knew my entire history and respected that I needed time to believe he wasn't secretly calculating my worth. He proposed after a year of dating, nothing fancy, just dinner at home and a ring he'd saved for months to buy. I said yes because I'd learned the difference between someone who loves you and someone who sees you as a resource to exploit. He cried when I said yes, actual tears, and told me he'd been nervous I'd say no, because I'd been hurt so badly before. I cried too because I genuinely believed I'd never trust anyone enough to marry again. We talked about prenups openly and honestly, and I insisted on one not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed the security of knowing my assets were protected. He agreed immediately, and said he understood completely, that protecting myself wasn't the same as not trusting him. Alice drew up the prenup, and he read it carefully and signed it without complaints or negotiations. His parents were excited about the engagement and never once asked about my financial situation or what I was bringing to the marriage. His mom hugged me and said she was glad her son found someone who made him happy. Planning the wedding became something I actually looked forward to instead of dreaded. Planning a wedding felt completely different this time. It was small and intimate with people who actually cared about me. not the large production Regina had orchestrated for my first wedding to show off to her friends while I paid for everything. We invited 30 people total, just close friends and family who'd supported us. My aunt walked me down the aisle, and my college best friend was my maid of honor. We got married in a small garden venue, nothing fancy, just flowers and string lights and folding chairs. I wore a simple dress I picked out myself, not the expensive designer gown Regina had insisted on for my wedding to Jake. We wrote our own vows, and I cried through mine because I was actually marrying someone who saw me as a person instead of a bank account. His vows promised to support my independence and respect my boundaries, and never make me feel like I owed him anything. We served barbecue instead of a formal dinner and played music we actually liked instead of what was traditional. Melissa sent a card wishing me happiness, and I appreciated that she understood she wasn't part of my new life, but genuinely wanted good things for me. My therapist came to the wedding and hugged me and said she was proud of how far I'd come. Alice gave a toast about watching me survive the worst betrayal possible and build something beautiful from the wreckage. My aunt talked about my father and how he'd be so proud of the woman I'd become. We danced under the lights, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in years, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, instead of what I had. The wedding day arrived on a perfect spring morning with clear skies and gentle warmth that felt like a good sign. My aunt arrived early to help me get ready, and she cried when she saw me in my simple white dress, telling me I looked just like my father's side of the family. My college best friend did my makeup and kept making jokes to calm my nerves, and I realized how lucky I was to have people who genuinely cared about my happiness instead of my bank account. We drove to the small garden venue together, and I felt none of the dread I'd experienced before my first wedding when Regina had controlled every detail and complained about costs I was paying. My aunt walked me down the short aisle between rows of folding chairs filled with 30 people who actually wanted to be there, and my fiancé's face when he saw me was everything I needed to know about making the right choice. My college best friend stood beside me as maid of honor, holding my bouquet and dabbing her eyes with a tissue, and I caught her grinning at me during the vows. The ceremony was short and personal, with words we wrote ourselves instead of traditional scripts, and when we kissed as husband and wife, everyone cheered like they meant it. At the reception, I found a card on the gift table from Melissa wishing me happiness, and saying she was glad I found someone who deserved me, and I appreciated that she understood our connection was about surviving Jake together, not building a friendship, but she still wanted good things for me. The barbecue dinner was casual and delicious, and we danced under string lights as the sun set, surrounded by people who proved every single day that I was worth more than my bank account. Starting this new chapter felt different because I'd learned through surviving my family's betrayal that protecting myself wasn't selfish, and that some people would always choose money over love, but I didn't have to let that define my future. I was building a life with people who saw me as a person instead of a resource, and that felt like the best possible outcome after everything I'd been through.